This is your reality check.
Hi everyone, and welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. This is the show for January 21st, 2020, and I'm your host, Darren McKee. With me, as usual, are Adam Gardner.
What's up, cuboids?
Christina Roach.
Hey everyone.
And producer Pat.
Hi, checkers.
We have a great show for you today. Adam is going to explore whether there's an epidemic of transgender violence in America.
Non-controversial segment there.
And then I'm going to give you a book review of The Master Algorithm. But first, Christina, what's so special about 10,000 steps a day?
Oh, nice.
I've noticed my gym is a little busier than usual this month, but seeing as fitness is often cited as a New Year's resolution, it's to be expected, right? Now, something I've heard many people say is that they are determined to get their 10,000 steps every day. Now, the popular notion is that one should hit 10,000 steps every day to stay healthy. For those who have wearable fitness trackers like Fitbit or the Apple Watch and smartphone apps, it's practically become a religion to do 10,000 steps a day, which comes out to about 8 kilometers or 5 miles. But David Cox wrote in The Guardian, the World Health Organization, the American Heart Foundation, and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services have all gradually adopted 10,000 steps as a daily activity recommendation. In Canada, Participation recommends 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity per week with no mention of specific step goals. But why 10,000 steps, guys? Says who? Pat, I know you have some background since you suggested this topic to me, so you're excluded. But Adam and Darren, what do you think? Why 10,000?
Humans love round numbers.
True.
It's like once you've gone through the 10,000 hours to learn something, then you just take 10,000 steps.
Right.
To be fair, I actually use the 10,000 steps as a rough estimate to track some modicum of activity. I really don't think my health hinges or falls if it's 9,000 versus 11,000.
Gotcha. How about you, Adam?
Yeah, I don't imagine it's in any way, some sort of optimal amount. I imagine it's a round number. I think in reality, the more exercise one gets is generally going to cause more fitness. It's probably not practical for people to do 30,000 steps in 4 hours of exercise a day, but you're not going to really hit a wall till you probably start doing like 10 hours of exercise a day and something like that. But, so I'd say if it helps motivate people, fine, but I don't think there's anything magical about that number.
I believe there are gyms where one of the exercises is hitting a wall.
Probably a CrossFit gym.
Well, maybe of no surprise to all of you and many listeners that the figure 10,000 is arbitrary.
What?
There really is no science to back up this specific number of steps. There is a good story, though, and I'm going to tell you the story. As Cox explains, the term actually originates from a marketing campaign in Japan in the mid-60s. I linked to a print ad in the show notes, and if you guys scroll down, you'll see the print ad. But the gist is that Yamasa developed the first wearable pedometer in hopes of capitalizing on the success of the '64 Olympics in Tokyo. The device was called a man-poke, when translated means 10,000 step meter. Now, Dr. Yoshio Hatano helped market the device after his research at Kyushu University of Health and Welfare studied the potential benefits of taking 10,000 steps and came up with 10,000 as the proper balance of, quote, caloric intake and activity-based calorie expenditure to maintain good health. Says Cox, they concluded that the average Japanese person took between 3,500 and 5,000 steps a day, and if these people increased their daily step count to 10,000, they could decrease their risk of coronary artery disease. Okay, important to note, I couldn't find anything to validate these results, so I'm not sure if we can consider it a proper unbiased study. I just saw it cited by several journalists, and I also read other journalists saying there's nothing to validate this stuff. In fact, the backstory, Dr. Hatano was worried the Japanese would lapse into a quote-unquote westernized lifestyle and calculated that walking 10,000 steps could burn up to 20% of one's daily calories or an extra 500 calories per day. I gotta tell you guys, 500 extra calories per day From 10,000 steps sounds pretty fishy to me, especially since your weight is a factor of how many calories you burn. Also, your intensity. Is it a brisk walk, a stroll?
I think this is an excellent point, Christina, and it's something that I will say bugs me. Now, I realize different apps calculate things in different ways, and I use the one that just happened to come with my phone. So for me, 10,000 steps is closer to 6.8 kilometers, and it's a couple hundred calories. It is not 500 at all. And on someone else's app, they're in the thousands. I'm like, thousands? What are you doing? Does it start with your baseline metabolic rate, and it's just including that, which is not really real or useful?
Well, a big criticism of pedometers, Darren, and the 10,000 step per day goal is that it doesn't take into account the intensity of the exercise. And that is something I read that researchers are currently studying. Do people who do 10,000 steps strolling around versus people hitting 10,000 doing sports or brisk walking achieve the same health benefits? To be continued.
Well, it's absolutely impossible. Like, if I run 5 kilometers or I walk 5 kilometers, there's no question that I will get more exercise by doing that equivalent in running in less time. So there's obviously going to be some other factor there, right?
But there is a target heart rate. So there is a point where if you're briskly walking versus running, you might still burn more calories running, but briskly walking is almost the same.
Sure. But when you factor in stuff like weight, well, I guess there's apps to do that too, but it further complicates the whole issue.
Yeah, it seems pretty subjective. Now back to square one. Why 10,000? Now, many have been questioning the veracity of this figure. Are there any legit studies out there that either corroborate or debunk this claim? Can you even really create a study with variables that could actually do that? Professor David Bassett, head of kinesiology, recreation, and sports studies at the University of Tennessee, tells The Guardian, quote, "There wasn't really any evidence for it at the time. They just felt that was a number that was indicative of an active lifestyle and should be healthy," end quote. As we all know, health and nutrition is an area rife with inaccurate info and unsubstantiated claims. Amanda Mull nicely puts it in The Atlantic. While basic guidelines can be helpful when they're accurate, human health is far too complicated to be reduced to a long chain of numerical imperatives. I thought of you, Darren, when I read that.
I wish my life was a long chain of numerical imperatives. It'd be the fourth and fifth thing I do.
As Mull says, most of the actual scientific studies conducted to try to gauge whether 10,000 steps a day is the magic number for health are pretty arbitrary. The studies simply compare people who have done 10,000 steps a day versus those who did much less, like 3 or 5K, by measuring how many calories burned, blood pressure, and blood glucose levels. Now, Mull cites Professor Katrine Tudor-Locke of the Center for Personalized Health Monitoring at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Quote, "This number keeps being reinforced because of the way research studies are designed. The study might find that 10,000 helps you lose more weight than 5,000, and then the media see it and report, yes, you should go with 10,000 steps. But that could be because the study has only tested 2 numbers. It didn't test 8,000, for example, and it didn't test 12,000.
El Diablo.
She goes on to say, we know that sedentary lifestyles are bad. And if you're taking fewer than 5,000 steps a day on average, this can lead to weight gain, increase your risk of bone loss, muscle atrophy, becoming diabetic, and a litany of issues. At the same time, there seems to be an obsession about 10,000 and how many steps are enough. Yet it's more important from a public health point of view to get people off their couches. The question we should really be asking is, how many steps are too few?
Ooh.
I liked that. Now, there are many criticisms that setting a universal target doesn't make sense for older people. It could have adverse consequences for people with chronic diseases, type 2 diabetes, and on the other hand, I read the target is probably way too low for kids.
It's also probably important to note that you shouldn't go from 2,000 to 10,000
Absolutely.
in a day, right?
Absolutely.
A universal target is just ridiculous, as you said. Like, there's a wide range of age and health and other functions, and maybe some people have comfy shoes and their feet are fine and other people don't, and then what? You know, it just doesn't make sense.
Are you walking in the snow? Are you walking uphill? There's so many things.
Are you walking less because you have some ailment? Yeah. A professor of epidemiology at Harvard U. I. Min Lee published a study in the Journal of the American Medical Association last May looking into the STEP rule. Her research, which looked at the STEP totals and mortality rates of 16,000 American women in their 70s found the benefits of walking plateaued after 7,500 steps, not 10,000. Says Lee, the basic finding was that at 4,400 steps per day, these women had significantly lower mortality rates compared to the least active women. So in a nutshell, if they did more than 4,400, mortality rates continued to drop, but at around 7,500 steps, the rates leveled out.
That's interesting.
Yes,
Very.
but again,
I wonder if that's applicable to people who are younger or not, though.
But again, Darren, it's not a perfect study, right? Were these people ill to begin with? I mean, these were people that were all healthy enough to walk to do the study, but did they do less steps again because they were kind of sick or there was something going on and that's why they died?
Were there enough people, say, doing 20,000 steps?
Right.
I mean, it just goes to demonstrate that one size does not fit all.
Absolutely. Nice. I link to many great articles that touch upon other studies I can't cover, but let me leave you with this. There is no question physical activity is good for your brain and good for your body. As Lee says, I'm not saying don't get 10,000 steps. If you can get 10,000 steps, more power to you. But if you're someone who's sedentary, even a very modest increase brings you significant health benefits. You do you, checkers.
Thank you, Cristina. And now we turn to Adam, who's going to investigate whether there's an epidemic of transgender violence in America.
That's right. Transgender people being murdered is a terrible thing. I don't think anyone reasonable would argue against this. The question I'm looking at, however, is if transgender murder is an epidemic, as the narrative seems to go. I understand this is a sensitive issue, so I will reiterate that any person being killed is a tragedy, and if we can do something to avoid hate crimes and other violence against transgender men and women, we absolutely should. That said, it is often stated that there is an epidemic of violence against the transgender community, and I wanted to look at this to see if it was true. I first saw claims questioning this statement in an article in the Washington Times. This cited numbers which were calculated by Kentucky State University's Wilfred Riley. He looked at 2017 homicide death rates, which he claims showed a transgender homicide death rate of 1.48 per 100,000 in the U.S. Now, this contrasts to the overall murder rate in the U.S., which is about 5 per 100,000. It's actually about 4.7, so he was close when he said that, which is over 3 times that number. The rate for men in general being 6.68 per 100,000, and for black people, 18.8 per 100,000.
That's so much higher.
Yeah,
it's a lot higher. Obviously, yes. If you're black or Latino, especially a man, your chances of getting murdered are much higher in the U.S. That is a problem of urban violence, something I mentioned in an earlier segment. Now, worth noting is that men are killed more often because men are often the ones doing the killing. Riley states that the trans murder rate is close to that of other women, and the actual rate for women is about 1 in 100,000, something he did not mention, but I had to find in some other stats. He also says that most transgender victims are killed in domestic disputes rather than hate crimes. This is his statement, not mine. If these numbers are to be believed, it actually does seem like there isn't much of an epidemic, but I think it's only fair to double check the sources on those numbers and maybe look at some high and low estimates, if there are some, to see if that changes anything. I also wondered who this Wilfred Riley was. Now, he's the author of a book, Hate Crime Hoax, How the Left is Selling a Fake Race War.
Oh.
Yeah. So it sounds like he's got a bit of a point he's trying to prove here, and this certainly fits with the narrative that he's pushing, and that goes against sort of the common narrative. Now, let's forget all that. I'm more of a facts and data guy, and I want to know what's right. So, for his numbers of murdered transgender people, Wilfred Riley is using the numbers given by the Human Rights Campaign. So what's this organization? They describe themselves as the largest national lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer civil rights organization. Needless to say, their numbers are not attempting to underestimate the number of transgender murders. They're actually trying to show that it is a big problem. They can be found in articles such as, and I quote, "A National Epidemic, Fatal Anti-Transgender Violence in America in 2018, which states that the number of murdered transgender people in that year, 22, is an epidemic. Worth noting, however, is that, and I quote from that article, Data collection is often incomplete or unreliable when it comes to violent and fatal crimes against transgender people, meaning that the number may in fact be much higher for many reasons, and we'll get back to that later. So from their point of view, that is a low end of the estimate. For the last 3 years, the Human Rights Campaign has claimed the number of murdered transgender people was 29 in 2017, 26 in 2018, and 22 in 2019. Since Wilfred Riley is using the 2017 number, which is the largest number, this would generate a larger rather than lower number, so he's not trying to fudge any data there by taking some uncharacteristically low murder rate year. The other way to get the statistics requires an estimate of the size of the transgender community in the United States. This is, of course, very difficult to estimate. This may be why sources such as the Human Rights Campaign use absolute numbers, but let's just be clear. Absolute numbers when it comes to things like murder are almost completely useless. This is why people think mass killings and terrorism are bigger problems than they are, because the number of victims seems big as numbers rather than as rates, which are relatively small. So Wilfred Riley uses the number 0.6% as an estimate of the percentage of transgender people in the United States. He also claims that some would put the number as high as 3%, which would significantly reduce the actual transgender murder rate based on his own numbers.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Now, I asked myself, what does the Human Rights Campaign say about this? They estimate the number of transgender people in the U.S. to be roughly 700,000 people, which would make about 0.3% of the total population of the United States. Now, this is from an estimate made by the Williams Institute. This estimate is actually lower than the figure Riley was using, which would more than double his estimate to give a rate of 3.14 out of 100,000, which is still a bit lower than the overall murder rate, but quite a bit higher than the murder rate of women. That's 1 in 100,000. Since neither the number of victims or of transgender people in the US are broken down by gender, however, it's a bit hard to tell what that number really means. If, for example, most transgender victims and people were women, then the number would be high. If most were men, then the number would be low. If they were proportional of the general population, then again, it might be a bit low, but it's hard to tease out what exactly those numbers mean. A DuckDuckGo search of number of transgender people in the US leads me to the same Williams Institute study, and a few links down, I see the 0.6% number that Riley used repeated there once again. So I don't think he was trying to get away with anything, but, he was using a number which made his argument look a bit better. Not drastically different, but a bit better. So much to say the numbers which Riley is using aren't far off from those being used by the very people claiming that there is a trans murder epidemic, though in this specific case he is off by a factor of roughly 2. Regardless of what those sources are saying, I think the numbers may be way off. The actual number of transgender people is difficult to estimate, so that number may actually be quite a bit higher or lower than the actual number, which could significantly change the rate, but we don't really have a reason to think that it's too high or too low. If we did, we'd be able to adjust our estimate. The real problem, though, is with estimating the number of victims. For many reasons, we should expect that the number is actually higher, though it would be difficult to tell how much higher. The estimate we have is probably the lower estimate. Some victims' deaths may be unreported. More common, however, would be the cases in which the murder is recorded but not identified as a transgender murder in the media for a number of reasons. It may just not have been publicized in the media at all. And in many cases, the authorities, media, or family may refuse to acknowledge the gender identity of the victim. So this happens quite often. Maybe the family becomes estranged from the victim because there's problems at home. Maybe this puts them at risk. A person gets murdered and then the family says, oh, my little girl, when it was a transgender man or something like that. So that's always a problem, and that could be a factor here. So the numbers we get, they're sort of a low estimate. How high they actually are, I couldn't answer that. It's very hard to tell. If the actual rate is triple what's calculated by Riley, then it would be equal to the national average, which still wouldn't be anything extraordinary. Although all transgender victims may not be the targets of hate crimes, we know that some of them are. Because of this, we can assume that, all other things being equal, this could mean that they would have a slightly higher murder rate than other groups if these hate crimes are above and beyond that. Basically, if a group is sometimes killed for a specific reason that doesn't apply to others, one would imagine their murder rate would be slightly higher. Can a murder rate lower than the US average actually make sense given some transgender people are targeted by hate crimes? While it may be that for one reason or another, transgender people are actually at a lower risk for being targeted by violence, whether we know what that actual reason is or not. Unfortunately, with the numbers we have, we can't really tell. Is there a national epidemic of fatal anti-transgender violence in the United States of America? No. It doesn't seem like there is. Using the numbers given by those very people claiming that there is an epidemic, the murder rate can be calculated as being lower than the national average, though the actual murder rate may in fact be much higher because that estimate may be low. It would be hard to argue, given the available data, that there is evidence of an epidemic. I think Riley's numbers are a bit low, but I don't think he's being intentionally deceptive. There isn't actually anyone presenting different numbers to say that it's actually higher. He's not disputing any other specific thing. All considered, I think it's possible that the transgender murder rate is close to the average, though it bears repeating that the numbers we have give a number lower than the average murder rate in the US.
Good job, Adam. I appreciate the nuanced take on all this. And when we talked about it before the show, it's like, well, it's going to be hard to get the numbers and then why someone might be murdered compared to a different type of group of people. But with the numbers, as you said, women on average in the States is about 1. Men are about 6.6. Black men are about 18. The average then, because of men and women, makes it about 3. And it seems like the high estimate for transgender people is about the same as that average, as you said. So it'd be hard to argue there's an epidemic. There'd have to be a massive undercounting of the number of murders of transgender people and or a massive overcounting of the population of transgender people.
Yeah, I think it's the fact that the people who are giving us the numbers as a source are using those to claim there's an epidemic. Those people aren't really doing the math.
And so, Adam, I assume that suicide is not part of this because I think the rate of suicide for transgender people is quite high, right?
Yeah, suicide is not included. I didn't look at that. If I'd have thought about it, maybe that would have been an interesting sort of side point, but I really don't know what those numbers are. So
Future show.
I couldn't tell you.
Thanks, Adam. And now I'm going to talk to you about the book, The Master Algorithm, How the Quest for the Ultimate Learning Machine Will Remake Our World by Pedro Domingos. I thought this book was excellent, with some caveats. Domingos manages to make the potentially extremely dry subject of machine learning interesting and engaging. His passion and enthusiasm for the power and potential of machine learning is clear, so one is well aware of his bias. And in this case, the occasional hyperbole only makes the book more readable. Yeah. He has some great pithy phrases. Here's one, for example. Quote, "People worry that computers will get too smart and take over the world, but the real problem is that they're too stupid and they've already taken over the world." The book provides an overview of how machine learning has impacted the world, some fundamental machine learning concepts, and then explores the 5 main tribes of machine learning, tribes meaning areas of domain or research that people are pursuing, and their respective learners. And I'll go through these 5 now. So 1, you have the symbolists, and they use inverse deduction. 2, the connectionists and their backpropagation. 3, the evolutionaries and the genetic algorithms. 4, the Bayesians and their probabilistic inference. And 5, the analogizers and the support vector machines. The goal is to combine them all into one master algorithm in the future, to rule them all, of which he is very optimistic about. Now, I can easily admit I didn't understand everything, but that was more due to the complexity of the subject itself and how much side homework I felt inclined or disinclined to do, not his lack of useful analogies and metaphors to aid understanding. Yep. Machine learning is really complicated. If you already have a background in it, this stuff will make a lot more sense. But if you don't, the analogy conceptual level, I think, is where you might want to start.
I think it's like he always explained a concept very well, but there were so many new concepts explained at such a fast rate that I would kind of forget them by the time they were referenced again. So I almost needed a cheat sheet to remind me what was going on. Right. So there's a lot of information in there.
So for me, the most accessible chapters will be the ones at the beginning and the last one because they're the least technical.
Sure.
Basically, he talks about machine learning being pervasive. If you're booking a flight, machine learning. If you're doing something with your bank, machine learning. If you're doing that, machine learning. It's basically everywhere and it's eating the world. When I had a discussion with this about friends, they appreciated that through the discussion of machine learning and the different tribes and their different approaches, it got to the heart of what does it mean to learn anything? And it was an extended exploration of what that might mean because he contrasts it with certain human abilities and whether machines can emulate humans or not. And so it's interesting to think about what it might mean to learn something and then, of course, how to instantiate that into a computer in some sort of way. Generally speaking, most people thought he was a bit too optimistic in the last chapters. This is where he's talking about any possible complications of machine learning in the future. He references the singularity. Is there going to be rogue AI and these sorts of things? He seems either really confident or kind of dismissive over things that I think he shouldn't be so dismissive about. Yep. Correctly, he is very much concerned about technological unemployment and things like, well, it's going to keep happening. And then when there's 50% unemployment, then you might have the democratic institutions finally have something like guaranteed annual income. And that may be what has to happen for things to change.
It's a lot of unemployment before we get to that
point. It really is.
Well,
now that's where he's actually not optimistic at all. That's pessimistic in some ways. But it is interesting to think about and a different perspective. Because if he's more positive and optimistic about things, say, for example, in the nature of war, the more robotic algorithms we can have fighting, the fewer humans will die. Mm-hmm. So he'll then say, as opposed to it being bad because people are more likely to wage wars, well, if you go to war with humans, it would be unethical, not going to war at all. And he does not seem to mention, though, that war is often asymmetrical, where there's one highly advanced society fighting and one that is less highly advanced. So you could imagine it is highly likely it'll be robots that can't die, or we don't really care as much if they die because it's just money, versus humans that can suffer in ways that robots cannot.
Or robots versus robots, and then when one side loses their robots, the other side's robots finally kill the people.
Yes, exactly.
Something like that.
Yes, exactly. Conventional war is a bit different than genocide.
Mm-hmm.
2 weeks in a row of the robots are coming to kill us.
Just trying to give you a heads up, bro.
Which is so funny because Darren is the guy who knows, admittedly, the least about how computers work.
But who may have read the most about whether robots are coming to kill us.
That's it.
Including arguments for and against. This book was published in 2015, and the paperback came out in 2018. And of course, I just read it in 2019 and 2020. Is it already out of date?
Yes.
Well, any sort of history of the moment by the time it's published, by definition, is going to be slightly out of date. It's just how much is the issue. I was speaking to my friend Dallas, who's been a guest on this show and is currently doing a postdoc in machine learning at Stanford. And he said that deep learning has really swept through the field in the past couple of years. So if you're looking for a really current hot take on exactly what's happening, this might not be that book. But if you're looking for a very recent, this is a couple of years ago, historical quote unquote analysis of what's happening in machine learning and how things came to be, I think it is highly valuable and very useful.
I think if you're looking for a recent take, something that's gone through the actual publishing process is by its very nature going to be outdated by the time you see it.
Yeah, of course. Now, at a meta level, I couldn't help but appreciate how far humanity has come. Not only do we have different types of machine learners, but we have the very concepts or the ideas themselves of symbolic logic, neural patterns, evolution, probability, and analogies. Each one of these, I think, is an important achievement that humanity's somewhat stumbled upon, somewhat understands, and we can use all of them to guide machine learning. Good work, people. This is when I put on the big historical lens, like, well, we have fire. That was an achievement. If we have these other things, and then people have come up with all these interesting, useful, complicated ideas, and then we, of course, use those to make even more interesting, useful, complicated things.
So, Darren, what are the chances that we might be able to entice Dallas to come back and talk to us about sort of this state of the art in terms of machine learning?
I think it's pretty high.
Awesome. That'd be great to have him back on.
That would be great.
Well, thanks for joining us once again, listeners. Cristina talked to us about whether 10,000 steps are necessary for your health and well-being, and it turns out they're not, but good exercise and repeated exercise is important for your health and well-being, so try to do that. Adam explored the transgender murder rate in the United States, and while there are numerous complications, it does seem like there's not an epidemic. And I talked to you about the master algorithm, which makes the case for machine learning being an accessible, interesting concept despite it being really complicated. Until next time, think better, to act better.
Peace out, cuboids.
A quick note, guys. CBC Podcast Playlist is going to be featuring a segment that we did on the Reality Check about how IKEA names its products. And that's coming on February 8th. So please check it out. And stay classy, not smartassy.
There you go.
Be careful of the robots, everyone.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
Boo, 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 boo.
Do 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 do. Do 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 do. Da-da-da-da-da-da.